The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Lake as Michael Thompson adjusted his tie and checked his watch for the third time. Judge Patricia Williams would arrive at his cabin within the hour, and he needed everything to be perfect. This meeting could determine the fate of his ongoing legal battle with the Lakeside Homeowners Association, and more specifically, with its tyrannical president, Karen Mitchell. Michael had purchased the lake cabin 3 years ago as a peaceful retreat from his demanding job as a software architect in downtown Minneapolis. The property sat on 2 acres of pristine shoreline with towering pines and a private dock that extended into the crystal-clear waters of Pine Lake. When he first saw the listing, he knew it was exactly what he needed after his divorce. A place to heal and find himself again. What he hadn't anticipated was the nightmare that came with living under the jurisdiction of an HOA run by a woman who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from making other people's lives miserable. Karen Mitchell had been the HOA president for 7 years, and in that time she had transformed what should have been a peaceful lakeside community into something resembling a police state. The trouble began almost immediately after Michael moved. Within 2 weeks of closing on the property, Karen appeared at his door with a clipboard and a stern expression. She was a woman in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never seemed to move, regardless of weather conditions. Her makeup was always flawless, and her clothes looked like they came straight from a department store catalog. But it was her eyes that unsettled Michael the most. They held a cold, calculating quality that suggested she was always looking for violations and infractions. She had introduced herself as the HOA president and proceeded to inform Michael of 17 different violations she claimed to observe during her initial inspection of his property. The dock was apparently 3 inches too long, according to her measurements. The mailbox was the wrong shade of black. His welcome mat was deemed inappropriate because it featured a cartoon fish. The list went on and on. Michael had politely explained that he had purchased the property as is and that the previous owners had assured him everything was HOA compliant. Karen had simply smiled that cold smile and told him that previous compliance meant nothing under her watch. She handed him a stack of violation notices and informed him he had 30 days to correct all issues or face fines. That first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next 3 years, Karen had issued Michael over 200 violation notices. She claimed his grass was too long when it reached 3 inches instead of the required 2.5. She cited him for having too many cars in his driveway when his brother visited for a weekend. She even issued a violation notice because his outdoor furniture was allegedly the wrong style for the lake. Community aesthetic. The fines had started small, but escalated quickly. What began as $50 penalties soon became $500 assessments. Karen seemed to take particular pleasure in finding new and creative ways to penalize Michael. She claimed his bird feeders were attracting too many birds, which violated noise ordinances. She cited him for having security cameras that she claimed invaded the privacy of neighbors. Even though the cameras only covered his own property, Michael had tried reasoning with her countless times. He attended every HOA board meeting and presented logical arguments against the violations. He provided documentation showing that many of his so-called infractions were actually permitted under the original HOA guidelines. Karen controlled the board completely. The other 4 members were either too intimidated to oppose her or genuinely believed in her vision of absolute compliance. The breaking point came 6 months ago when Karen issued a violation notice claiming that Michael's deck railing was 2 inches too low and posed a safety hazard. She demanded he tear down the entire deck and rebuild it to her specifications at an estimated cost of $30,000. When Michael refused, she placed a lien on his property and threatened foreclosure proceedings. That was when Michael decided he had had enough. He hired the best real estate attorney he could find and began building a case against the HOA. What they discovered during the investigation was shocking. Karen had been systematically abusing her position for years. She had issued thousands of inappropriate violation notices to homeowners throughout the community. Many had simply paid the fines rather than fight because they didn't understand their rights or couldn't afford legal representation. More disturbing was the discovery that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. She had charged the association for expensive dinners, claiming they were board meetings. She had billed the HOA for landscaping services at her own home. She had even used association money to pay for a luxury vacation that she claimed was necessary for researching HOA best practices at a resort in Hawaii. Michael's attorney had uncovered evidence of financial impropriety exceeding $200,000 over 5 years. They had also documented a pattern of harassment and discrimination that violated both state HOA laws and federal civil rights statutes. The case was strong enough that they had been able to get the attention of the U.S. District Court judge. Patricia Williams had agreed to hear their federal civil rights claim and had suggested an informal meeting at Michael's cabin to better understand the situation. She was known for taking an unconventional approach to complex cases and believed that seeing the actual property would help her make more informed decisions. Michael spent the morning preparing his cabin for the judge's visit. All his documentation in neat folders and prepared a timeline of events that clearly showed the pattern of harassment. His attorney, David Chen, had arrived early to help review their presentation and ensure they covered all the key points. David was a sharp lawyer in his early 40s who specialized in HOA disputes. He had seen plenty of abusive HOA situations, but described Michael's case as one of the worst he had encountered. David had grown up in a family of civil rights attorneys and had a particular passion for cases involving abuse of power by small local authorities as they reviewed the materials. One final time, David reminded Michael of the significance of this meeting. If Judge Williams agreed to hear their federal case, it could result in a complete restructuring of the HOA and potentially criminal charges against Karen for her financial crimes. It could also set important precedents for HOA accountability. That would benefit homeowners across the country. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Judge Williams. Michael took a deep breath and walked to the front door to greet her. Judge Patricia Williams was an impressive woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a casual blazer and slacks appropriate for the informal setting, but still carried herself with the dignity and authority of her position. She greeted Michael warmly and complimented him on the beautiful property. As they walked toward the cabin, she observed the various features that had been the subject of so many violation notices. The supposedly too long dock looked perfectly reasonable, extending into the lake. The mailbox appeared to be standard black, and in good condition. The outdoor furniture was attractive and well-maintained. Inside the cabin, Judge Williams accepted an offer of coffee, and they settled around the dining room table, where Michael had arranged all his documentation. David began by providing an overview of the case and the legal issues involved. He explained how the HOA had exceeded its authority and violated both state regulations and federal civil rights laws. Michael then walked the judge through the timeline of harassment, starting with that first visit from Karen. He showed her photographs of each alleged violation and the corresponding HOA citations. Many of the violations were clearly frivolous, and some contradicted previous HOA approvals. Judge Williams took notes and asked thoughtful questions about each incident as they discussed the financial irregularities. David presented bank records and receipts showing how Karen had misused HOA funds. The evidence was substantial and well documented. Judge Williams appeared increasingly interested as she reviewed the materials and asked detailed questions about the HOA's financial oversight procedures. They had been meeting for about 45 minutes when they heard a car door slam outside. Michael looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. Karen Mitchell was marching toward his front door with her usual determined stride and angry expression. She was wearing one of her typical outfits, a navy blue blazer with matching slacks, and her blonde hair was perfectly arranged despite the morning humidity. Michael immediately recognized the signs of one of Karen's legendary confrontations. Her face was flushed red, and she was carrying her ever-present clipboard and digital camera. She had clearly worked herself into one of her righteous rages and was preparing for battle. Before Michael could warn his guests or attempt to prevent what was about to happen, Karen was pounding on the front door with enough force to rattle the windows. Her voice carried clearly through the cabin as she shouted demands to be let inside immediately. Judge Williams raised an eyebrow and looked at Michael with a mixture of curiosity and concern. David immediately recognized the situation and began reaching for his phone to record what was likely to become evidence in their case. The pounding continued and grew more insistent. Karen was now shouting that she had every right to inspect the property for violations and that Michael could not hide behind closed doors to avoid HOA regulations. Her voice had taken on the shrill quality it always acquired when she felt her authority was being challenged. Michael looked at Judge Williams apologetically and explained that this was Karen Mitchell, the HOA president they had been discussing. The judge nodded with obvious interest and suggested they allow her inside so she could observe the situation firsthand. David agreed that it would be valuable evidence and prepared his recording device. Michael reluctantly opened the door and Karen pushed past him without invitation. She strode into the living room with her clipboard raised and began loudly announcing various violations she claimed to observe. She pointed at a decorative pillow and declared it was the wrong color. Scheme for the lake community. She photographed a coffee mug sitting on an end table and claimed it violated guidelines about visible clutter. It was then that Karen noticed they had guests. She paused mid-sentence and stared at Judge Williams and David with obvious suspicion. Her eyes narrowed as she took in their professional attire and the documents spread across the dining room table. Michael attempted to introduce Judge Williams, but Karen cut him off with a dismissive wave. She announced that she was conducting official HOA business and that any guests would need to leave immediately. The property inspection could not be delayed and all violations needed to be documented right away. Judge Williams remained seated at the dining room table and calmly introduced herself. She explained that she was a federal judge meeting with Michael regarding his legal dispute with the HOA. Her tone was professional but carried an unmistakable note of authority. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Karen's face went through several color changes, starting with pale white and progressing to deep red. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. The clipboard in her hands began to shake visibly. For a moment, it seemed like Karen might simply turn around and leave. But then her natural combativeness reasserted itself, and she drew herself up to her full height. She declared that she didn't care who Judge Williams claimed to be. The HOA had authority over this property and no outside interference would be tolerated. David tried to explain the legal situation, but Karen refused to listen. She began pointing her camera at the judge and taking photos while loudly describing supposed violations in the cabin. She claimed the furniture arrangement violated fire safety codes. She photographed the coffee service and declared it evidence of commercial activity in a residential zone. Judge Williams watched this performance with obvious fascination. She asked Karen to explain the specific authority she believed gave her the right to enter private property without permission and photograph guests without consent. The question seemed to confuse Karen, who stammered something about HOA enforcement powers. The situation escalated when Karen demanded that Judge Williams provide identification to prove she was really a federal judge. She claimed that Michael was probably using fake officials to intimidate the HOA board. When Judge Williams politely declined to provide identification, Karen became even more agitated. She began pacing around the cabin, taking photos of everything, while loudly describing each supposed violation. The curtains were the wrong style. The books on the shelf were arranged improperly. The kitchen displayed evidence of unauthorized food preparation. Her commentary became increasingly bizarre and disconnected from any reasonable interpretation of HOA regulations. David was recording everything on his phone while taking detailed notes. This was exactly the kind of behavior they needed to demonstrate the pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. Judge Williams continued to observe calmly, but Michael could see she was taking mental notes of every detail. Karen seemed completely oblivious to how her behavior appeared to an outside observer. She was so caught up in her role as HOA enforcer that she failed to recognize she was providing perfect evidence for the case against her. She photographed Judge Williams' coffee cup and declared it a violation of the no commercial activity rule. She measured the distance between furniture pieces and announced they violated spacing requirements. The absurdity reached new heights. When Karen began inspecting the bathroom and taking photos of the soap dispenser, which she claimed was not approved for lake community use, Judge Williams finally stood up and walked over to observe Karen directly. She asked specific questions about each violation and requested to see the exact HOA rules that were supposedly being broken. Karen fumbled through papers on her clipboard, but could not produce specific regulations supporting most of her claims. When pressed for details, she became defensive and accused Judge Williams of interfering with official HOA business. She threatened to report the judge to higher authorities for obstruction of justice. David pointed out that Judge Williams was the higher authority in this situation, and that federal courts had jurisdiction over civil rights violations. Karen dismissed this as irrelevant legal technicalities and continued her inspection. She was now in the bedroom taking photos of the bed, which she claimed was positioned in violation of feng shui requirements that had never existed in any HOA document. The breaking point came when Karen attempted to go outside and inspect the dock while the meeting was still in progress. Judge Williams firmly but politely told her that she was disrupting an official legal proceeding and needed to leave immediately. Karen refused and claimed that HOA business took priority over any court meetings. Michael finally found his voice and asked Karen to leave his property. He explained that she had no right to enter without permission and that her behavior was being recorded as evidence in their legal case. Karen laughed and said that HOA presidents had the right to inspect any property at any time for violations. Judge Williams asked to see the specific HOA documents that granted such authority. Karen again fumbled through her papers but could not produce anything supporting her claims. She became increasingly flustered as she realized she could not justify her actions with actual regulations. The situation became even more surreal when Karen began taking measurements of the ceiling height, claiming it violated building codes that had never been part of HOA regulations. She was now clearly making up violations as she went along, apparently believing that her authority was unlimited. David asked Karen to explain how ceiling height related to HOA landscape and architectural guidelines. She responded with a rambling explanation about structural integrity and community standards that made no logical sense. Judge Williams took notes as Karen continued to demonstrate exactly the kind of arbitrary and capricious behavior that formed the basis of their legal case. Karen seemed to realize she was being recorded and demanded that David stop filming. When he refused, she threatened to call the police and have him arrested for trespassing. David calmly explained that he was a guest on private property with permission from the owner, and that recording was legal. The confrontation continued for another 20 minutes, with Karen finding new and increasingly ridiculous violations throughout the cabin. She photographed the refrigerator, claiming it was too large for residential use. She measured window openings and declared them non-compliant with ventilation requirements. She even took photos of electrical outlets, claiming they were improperly positioned. Judge Williams asked increasingly detailed questions about each alleged violation and the authority supporting Karen's actions. It became clear that Karen had no understanding of the legal limits of HOA power and believed she had unlimited authority over homeowners. In the community, finally Karen announced that she was issuing immediate violation notices for over 30 different infractions she had documented during her inspection. She began writing citations with fines totaling more than $15,000. Judge Williams asked to review each citation and the supporting regulations. As Karen attempted to justify each violation, it became obvious that most had no basis in actual rules. She was creating arbitrary standards and applying them retroactively. When Judge Williams pointed this out, Karen became defensive and accused everyone of conspiring against proper HOA governance. The scene reached peak absurdity when Karen attempted to issue a violation notice to Judge Williams personally for disrupting an HOA inspection. She claimed that federal judges had no authority to interfere with local housing regulations and that Judge Williams was subject to community standards while on HOA property. David explained that federal courts had supremacy over local regulations and that civil rights laws superseded HOA rules. Karen dismissed this as irrelevant legal jargon and continued writing violation notices. She seemed completely disconnected from reality and convinced of her absolute authority. Judge Williams finally stood up and formally identified herself as a federal judge conducting official court business. She explained that Karen's behavior was being documented as evidence in a federal civil rights case and advised her to consult with an attorney before taking any further actions. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Karen suddenly realized the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences of her behavior. Her face went pale again, and she stopped writing violation notices. For the first time since arriving, she seemed to grasp that she might have made a serious mistake, but rather than apologize or retreat, gracefully Karen doubled down on her position. She declared that federal judges had no business interfering with local HOA matters and that she would fight any attempt to undermine proper community governance. She threatened to report Judge Williams to judicial oversight authorities for exceeding her jurisdiction. Michael watched this entire exchange with a mixture of horror and amazement. He had experienced Karen's unreasonable behavior many times, but had never seen her quite this disconnected from reality. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that her authority had limits and that other people had rights. David continued recording as Karen gathered her materials and prepared to leave. She announced that all the violations she had documented would stand, and that fines would be assessed immediately. She warned that any attempt to challenge her authority would result in additional penalties and possible foreclosure proceedings. As she reached the door, Karen turned back and delivered one final threat. She claimed that she would use all her influence to ensure that Michael faced maximum penalties for his defiance of HOA regulations. She also warned Judge Williams that federal interference in local housing matters would not be tolerated by the community. With that final outburst, Karen stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle dishes. In the kitchen, through the window, they could see her marching back to her car. While continuing to take photos of the property from various angles, the silence that followed her departure was profound. Judge Williams sat back down at the dining room table and looked at Michael with an expression that mixed sympathy with amazement. David stopped recording and immediately began reviewing the footage to ensure they had captured everything clearly. Judge Williams was the first to speak. She observed that she had presided over many complex cases during her career, but had rarely seen such a clear example of abuse of authority and harassment. She noted that Karen's behavior had provided compelling evidence for every aspect of their legal claims. David agreed that the recording would be invaluable. Evidence demonstrating the pattern of harassment and the arbitrary nature of HOA enforcement. He pointed out that Karen had essentially prosecuted their case for them by demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior they were challenging in court. Michael felt a mixture of relief and vindication. For 3 years, he had tried to explain to friends and family what he was dealing with, but many people found it hard to believe that someone could be so unreasonable and abusive. Judge Williams had now witnessed firsthand exactly what he faced on a regular basis. The judge asked Michael to describe how frequently these confrontations occurred and whether Karen's behavior that morning was typical. Michael explained that while this episode was particularly dramatic, it was not unusual in terms of Karen's basic approach to HOA enforcement. She routinely entered property without permission, took photos without consent, and issued violations based on arbitrary personal preferences rather than actual regulations. David presented additional documentation showing the pattern of abuse over time. He had organized the evidence to demonstrate that Karen's behavior was not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic campaign to harass homeowners who challenged her authority. Michael was not the only target, but he had become her primary focus after he began questioning her actions. Judge Williams reviewed the materials with obvious interest. She asked detailed questions about the HOA's financial oversight and governance structure. It became clear that Karen had consolidated power over the years and eliminated most checks on her authority. The other board members were either allies who supported her methods or opponents who had been intimidated into silence. The financial evidence was particularly compelling. David had uncovered a pattern of questionable expenses and potential embezzlement spanning several years. Karen had used HOA funds for personal benefits while claiming they were necessary business expenses. She had also manipulated the budget process to fund her enforcement activities while neglecting actual community maintenance needs. Judge Williams noted that the financial irregularities alone could support criminal charges and that the civil rights violations provided grounds for federal intervention. She explained that HOAs were not above the law and that homeowners had constitutional protections against arbitrary government action, even at the local level. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed the legal strategy and potential remedies. Judge Williams seemed particularly interested in the systemic nature of the problems and the impact on the broader community. She asked about other homeowners who might have been affected and whether there was evidence of discrimination against particular groups. Michael explained that Karen seemed to target anyone who questioned her authority, regardless of their background. However, there did appear to be some pattern of more severe enforcement against newer residents and people she perceived as outsiders to the established community. Several elderly residents had paid thousands in fines rather than fight because they found the confrontations too stressful. David had interviewed other affected homeowners and documented similar patterns of harassment and abuse. Many people were afraid to speak out because they feared retaliation from Karen and the HOA board. The few who had challenged violations faced escalating penalties and threats of foreclosure. Judge Williams asked about the broader community response and whether there was support for reform of the HOA governance structure. Michael explained that many residents were frustrated but felt powerless to change the situation. Karen had been very effective at dividing the community and silencing opposition through intimidation and financial pressure, the judge observed. That this type of local tyranny was unfortunately common in HOA communities across the country. She had seen similar cases where individuals in positions of limited authority became convinced they had unlimited power over their neighbors. The insularity of HOA governance often allowed such abuse to continue unchecked for years, as they concluded. The formal meeting, Judge Williams thanked Michael for his hospitality and commended him for standing up to the harassment. She noted that many people in similar situations simply moved away or gave up rather than fight for their rights. His willingness to pursue legal action could benefit many other homeowners facing similar abuse. David gathered all the materials and assured Judge Williams that they would provide additional documentation as requested. The case file was now substantial and included evidence of both the harassment campaign and the financial irregularities. They were confident that they had grounds for both civil and criminal action. Judge Williams explained the next steps in the legal process and the timeline for federal court review. She warned that HOA cases could be complex and time-consuming, but assured them that the evidence was strong enough to warrant serious consideration. The behavior they had witnessed that morning had only strengthened their position. As they prepared to leave, David reminded Michael that Karen's morning visit had actually been a gift to their case. Her behavior had provided perfect evidence of the arbitrary and capricious enforcement they were challenging. No jury would have trouble understanding that her actions were unreasonable and abusive. After seeing the recording, Michael walked Judge Williams to her car and thanked her for taking the time to meet at his cabin. She assured him that seeing the property and witnessing Karen's behavior firsthand had been invaluable for understanding the case. She encouraged him to document any further harassment and to contact David immediately if Karen attempted any retaliation. As the judge's car disappeared down the gravel driveway, Michael felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he had allies who understood what he was facing and had the power to do something about it. Karen's decision to storm into the cabin during the meeting might have been the biggest mistake she had ever made. David lingered for a few more minutes to discuss strategy and next steps. He was obviously energized by the morning's events and confident that they now had overwhelming evidence to support their case. He warned Michael that Karen would likely escalate her harassment as she realized the seriousness of the legal threat, but assured him that any retaliation would only strengthen their position. They spent some time reviewing the recording and identifying the most damaging segments for use in court proceedings. Karen's bizarre claims about violations and her complete disregard for property rights and legal authority were captured clearly on video. Her threats against a federal judge and her claims of unlimited HOA authority would be particularly powerful evidence. David also noted that Karen's financial records had revealed even more irregularities than they initially discovered. She had been using HOA credit cards for personal purchases and had failed to properly document many expenses claimed as business costs. The evidence suggested systematic embezzlement over several years, totaling potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. As David prepared to leave, he reminded Michael to maintain detailed records of any further contact with Karen or the HOA board. Every violation, notice, phone call, or confrontation should be documented with dates, times, and witnesses if possible. The pattern of harassment was now clearly established, but additional evidence would make their case even stronger. Michael spent the rest of the day organizing his thoughts and reviewing the materials from the meeting. The morning had been surreal but ultimately productive. Karen's behavior had been so outrageous that it eliminated any doubt about the validity of his complaints. No reasonable person could watch the recording and conclude that her actions were appropriate or legal. That evening, Michael called his brother Tom to update him on the day's events. Tom had been supportive throughout the HOA ordeal, but had sometimes wondered if Michael was overreacting to what might be normal. The recording of Karen's behavior eliminated any such doubts and left Tom speechless at the extent of her unreasonable conduct. Michael also reached out to several neighbors who had experienced similar problems with Karen and the HOA board. He was careful not to share specific details about the legal strategy, but wanted them to know that action was being taken. Several expressed interest in supporting the case and providing their own evidence of harassment and abuse. The response from other homeowners was encouraging but also troubling. As Michael spoke with more neighbors, he realized that Karen's behavior was even worse than he had understood. She had been systematically targeting anyone who showed signs of independence or resistance to her authority. The violations and fines were just one tool in a broader campaign of intimidation and control. Over the following days, Michael began documenting additional evidence and connecting with other affected homeowners. He discovered that Karen had the network of allies in the community who helped her monitor and report on their neighbors' activities. This informal surveillance system allowed her to issue violations for minor infractions that most people would never notice or care about. The investigation also revealed that Karen had been manipulating HOA elections and board appointments to maintain her control. She had discouraged opposition candidates and used procedural tricks to limit voter participation. Several homeowners reported being told that attending meetings or running for board positions would result in increased scrutiny of their properties. As the legal case developed, Michael felt a growing sense of responsibility to seek justice, not just for himself, but for the entire community. Karen's abuse of power had affected hundreds of families and caused significant financial and emotional harm. Her behavior represented exactly the kind of local tyranny that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent. The weeks following Judge Williams's visit brought a series of escalating confrontations as Karen realized the serious threat to her position. She began issuing even more violation notices and increased the fines for alleged infractions. She also started spreading rumors about Michael and attempting to turn other homeowners against him. David had warned that retaliation was likely and advised Michael to document everything carefully. Each new harassment incident provided additional evidence for their case and demonstrated that Karen was incapable of moderating her behavior, even when facing legal consequences. The community began to divide between those who supported Karen's strict enforcement approach and those who recognized her behavior as abusive and illegal, as several homeowners came forward with their own stories of harassment and offered to testify in support of Michael's case. The solidarity was encouraging, but also highlighted how much damage Karen had done over the years. As autumn arrived at Pine Lake, Michael reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since purchasing what he thought would be a peaceful retreat. Instead of the tranquil sanctuary he had envisioned, he had found himself at the center of a legal battle that would determine whether homeowners had any protection against abusive HOA governance. The case had grown beyond his personal dispute, with Karen to encompass broader questions about the limits of private governance and the rights of homeowners in deed-restricted communities. Federal courts rarely intervened in HOA disputes, but the evidence of systematic abuse and potential criminal behavior made his case exceptional. Michael knew that the legal battle would continue for months or even years, but he was committed to seeing it through to conclusion. The morning when Karen stormed into his cabin and confronted a federal judge had been a turning point that made victory possible. Her own behavior had provided the evidence needed to hold her accountable for years of abuse and harassment. As winter approached, Pine Lake Michael prepared for the long legal fight ahead. He had excellent representation, strong evidence, and the support of many neighbors who had suffered under Karen's tyrannical rule. Most importantly, he had the backing of a federal judge who had witnessed firsthand the behavior they were challenging. In court, the cabin that had been intended as a peaceful retreat had become the headquarters for a civil rights battle that could impact HOA governance nationwide. Michael was determined to ensure that no other homeowner would have to endure the harassment and abuse that had defined his experience at Pine Lake. The legal documents were filed, and the federal case was officially underway. Karen Mitchell and the Lakeside Homeowners Association would finally face accountability for their actions. The woman who had believed her authority was unlimited was about to learn that even HOA presidents must follow the law and respect the constitutional rights of their neighbors. The story of the morning when Karen stormed into Michael's cabin while he was meeting with Judge Williams would become a central piece of evidence in the federal case. Her behavior had been so outrageous and her claims of authority so obviously excessive that no jury could fail to understand the nature of the abuse Michael and other homeowners had endured. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Michael continued to live at his lake cabin and document any further harassment from Karen or the HOA board. Each additional incident only strengthened their case and demonstrated the need for federal intervention to protect homeowners from abusive local governance. The battle was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a comprehensive victory that would fundamentally change the power dynamics in the lakeside community. Karen Mitchell had finally overreached so dramatically that her reign of terror was coming to an end. The federal courts would ensure that constitutional rights were respected and that no HOA president could claim unlimited authority over there. Neighbors thought the morning confrontation had been shocking and surreal, but it had also been the beginning of the end for Karen's abusive regime. Michael Thompson was determined to see justice done and to create a precedent that would protect other homeowners from similar harassment and abuse. The fight for HOA accountability was just beginning, and he was ready for the challenge.